Teaching Truly, a curriculum to indigenize mainstream education. By Adriana, Jazmine, Tyler, and Emma. Teaching Truly offers subject area specific vision and guidelines for how we can challenge hegemonic influences and incorporate indigenous perspectives into mainstream education. Our group pulled out 5 major themes from the book that we'll walk you through in this video.
The major themes presented in the book take place in the first 2 chapters, which are anti-Indianism and historical trauma of Native Americans. There are several important information provided within these first 2 chapters, so I added in-depth information within these first 4 slides for you to look back on, but will not cover all of them within this video. The first part, anti-Indianism, is a term used to describe the lack of acknowledgement and respect for Native American nations, whether it's through denial, oppression, ignorance, racism, erasure, omission, stereotyping, disinformation, or any other means. As you can see on the slides, the author provides F.R. McKenna's 3 categories of scholars, as well as the Manitoba Indian Brotherhood's 10 kinds of biases that impact Native American education. In broad terms, it provides us with an idea of how Indians have been poorly represented in the education system, as well as the why. To get a better idea of what this means, I provided some examples that were talked about within the book. We tied this chapter with Benita Love's spirit murdering concept, where instead of physical acts of harm on a race, they are doing it solely through the spirit. They are reducing Indigenous students to where they are not included in the curriculum, not given the same nutrients or acceptance, but instead are being humiliated and destroyed spiritually. Which leads me to the second part of the theme, historical trauma. Throughout history, Native American communities have been faced with oppression, racism, and erasure. These 2 slides provide a small outline of the historical events that Native Americans went through and how they continually occur throughout the past several hundred years. You can pause the video to read some of the historical events in depth, but I'd like to go more into depth about the concept of historical trauma. 4 Arrows provides 3 main types of trauma, which are cultural, historical, and intergenerational. Oftentimes, we like to think that these are events that occurred in the past, but don't realize how the trauma is being passed on. In present day, there is a high amount of alcohol and drug abuse within tribal communities, and this is a form of coping because they have not yet healed from the trauma that occurred to their people. This brings in the cultural grief interventions that need to take place in order to heal, which are listed on the slide, as well as a few of the ways in which a dominant society can subjugate another group. The final thought I'd like to bring up about the historical trauma chapter is the peoplehood matrix, which provides 4 major components of Indian people, which are language, sacred history, place or territory, and ceremonial cycles. He states that these 4 components are interwoven as well as dependent on one another, and that neither is greater or lesser than the other. These are the major components we wanted to present on the first 2 chapters, but there is so much more information that can be learned from them.
As a group, we decided that this chapter on historical trauma would be the most valuable for our classmates to read, if they had to pick one. As teachers, the insights in this chapter can help us to better serve our students who experience this type of trauma.
Another major theme in this book is a call for more holistic ways of thinking and knowing in mainstream education, a call to recognize the interconnectedness of all things, especially between humans and the rest of the world. Western ways of thinking tend to be reductionist, to categorize, break systems up into pieces, and often place those pieces into a hierarchy. When this Western thinking is applied to education, you get strict subject area boundaries, with little opportunity for students to make interdisciplinary connections or connections to their own culture, family, or spirituality. The author of Teaching Truly suggests that we begin to dissolve subject area boundaries in order to develop a more holistic education. When Western thinking is applied to the natural world, you get reductionist science, which breaks complex systems down into smaller parts, assuming that the whole is not greater than the sum of its parts. Though this approach has afforded incredible discoveries, it can be problematic from an ecological perspective. If we're not thinking about the larger interwoven system, we cannot truly understand the far-reaching impacts we are having on the environment. Western thinking about the natural world also yields anthropocentrism, which sees humanity as separate from and superior to the rest of the natural world. Therefore, the earth is ours to commodify and exploit. The indigenous perspectives presented in Teaching Truly challenge anthropocentrism. They emphasize interconnectedness and balance between all things. Humans can live in responsible relationship and harmony to all aspects of the land. Animals are our teachers, and the earth is not ours to exploit. We connected this theme of holism and holistic education to the work of John Dewey, who critiqued mainstream education's practice of disconnecting subject matter knowledge from the rest of experience, or from the actual conditions of human life. A more holistic approach to education, like the one suggested in Teaching Truly, would instead seek to connect subject matter knowledge to the rest of human experience. The author of Teaching Truly touches on this theme of holism in his chapter about science education. To bring more holism into the science classroom, teachers can challenge reductionism by making more space for hologizing, or learning to look at the whole while simultaneously looking at its parts. Science teachers can also encourage creative thinking, discuss the interface of science and culture, and use an interdisciplinary approach which views science in relationship to the greater whole of human knowledge systems.
The third major theme in this book is the idea of individualistic versus a community-based way of living. We realize that education is very much like a competition in which you try to outperform your peers, and those that do the best will go further in life. However, there is also this cultural, class, and gender bias within these educational matters, which we connected with the Aeon reading, who presented this experiment in which he realized that students were often being educated in terms of what class they are expected to go out into. The educational structure is a key component of shaping students to think individualistically and to compare one another so that we can outperform or compete better to become effective citizens for the society. Four Arrows presents this idea through the economics portion of the book, where they make this point of view of how children are the most impressionable and easiest to change. Society's current system is capitalistic, and oftentimes we are shaped to be individuals who focus on moving up the hierarchy, generate wealth, and hold some level of power within the world. This framework is perpetuated in schools by not allowing students to bring questions about the capitalistic system to the table, teaching students early on the ways it works, making the goal of succeeding in life be through accumulation of wealth or owning property. Another fact that I feel presents how this capitalistic and individualistic framework has fought to be sustained is the fact that in 1951, 89% of teachers used industry-sponsored materials. 89%. Corporations want to keep the system in place and know that schools are a key component of doing that. They want to give the sense that natural resources are there for us to use, certain jobs are more important, and that wealth and power are what we should strive for. However, Indigenous education does not think individualistically or capitalistic. Instead, they think in a more community-based way and see the interconnectedness of us as a species with the rest of the world. For example, math is presented in a dry, abstract, and dehumanizing way instead of alive and immediate. With Indigenous people, they believe math is presented all around in the real world. An example of this in the book is when a teacher asks a student what 1 plus 1 plus 1 is, and the student says, chord. The teacher might think it's a foolish answer, but to the student it makes perfect sense because in her music class, she learned that 3 notes make up a chord. These creative ways of connecting with the real world is often suppressed in school classrooms as they work to prepare them for a capitalistic society in which resources, property, money, and power are important. However, within the Indigenous community, they find values in reciprocity, generosity, balance, and interconnectedness. There is this interesting outlook on prestige that was presented in the book where Indigenous communities view prestige as being connected to humility and was measured by how generous a person or the way they show care for those around them, regardless if they like them or not. Four Arrows is also bringing up this idea of the gift economy, where indigenous communities are presented by a complex system in which reciprocal gift giving occurs, and it was about generosity. Indigenous communities focus on caring about and balancing with one another and the world around them. This allowed us to connect it to the Noddings article about caring and the importance of teaching students to care, which brings me back to the saying in the book that we cannot exclude anybody if we are truly to be indigenized.
Another theme of this book was storytelling with how it pertains to U.S. history. The Western storytelling of today in social studies is isolation from the idea of knowledge of the unpleasant, in which they call it in this book, and they do this by using selective storytelling. Selective storytelling protects from the sense that they or their direct ancestors had anything to do with the awful events of cultural encounters, or that they directly benefit from them in any way today. Historians tell the history from a war-to-war timeline and have great biographies about these great men of U.S. history. And you can kind of see this highlighted by using Mount Rushmore and statues around the country as examples. And then you get to the indigenous storytelling, which is one that tells history where peace is a focal point. Storytelling follows cycles. There is a time and place for each story. The community, not any individual, is a focus. And there are many important indigenous leaders or peoples, but what is talked about more is about the deeds of these people rather than them as an individual. Biography is not an indigenous genre. And lastly, indigenous history presents all versions of every story from all points of view instead of imposing the view of just the most powerful or elite group onto everyone. This theme related to a reading that we did in class, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the banking concept versus the problem-posing theory. The banking concept is a concept in education, which is a method of teaching and learning where the students simply store the information relayed to them by the teacher. Students are supposed to listen and accept authority rather than question it. And this is kind of what you see when you have the Western view of history, where the teacher is kind of telling you what you're going to learn, and you're kind of just taking it in. You don't get any of the other sides of the story or the history that is being taught to you. And this is kind of what we've been seeing in Western social studies classes. Versus the problem-posing theory, which problem-posing education is an active learning strategy where a teacher or student poses a problem and the class gets together to collaborate to find answers. And in this theory, it's kind of argued that all learning should be both theoretical and practical. Information needs to be presented to link to real life, and students need to know why and how the theoretical information impacts their lives. So you get this with the indigenous view of history, where you can see a problem in today's society and kind of talk about it, and then talk about kind of what was done long ago and kind of relate it to what's going on now and see the similarities and differences, and students can kind of make connections, and they'll also be able to see the different views around history, which is kind of what the idea where you have different points of views, and instead of just imposing just this one view that has often always been.
Our fifth theme of Indigenous inclusivity is connected to geography by creating a space that focuses on inclusion of everything around us. In Chapter 12, there is an emphasis on the National Council for Geographic Education. They created a 272-page book entitled Geography for Life that talks about 18 standards that are divided into 6 essential elements. The 6 elements are the world in spatial, places and regions, physical systems, human systems, environment and society, and the use of geography. Within the first element, it describes how to use geographic representations to organize information about people, places, and environments. It also describes how to analyze the spatial organization of people, places, and environments on Earth's surface. Element number 2 describes physical and human characteristics, places. People create regions to interpret Earth's complexity and how culture and experiences influence people's perception of places and regions. For element number 3, it touches on the physical process that shape the patterns and the characteristics and spatial distributions of ecosystems on Earth's surface. Element number 4 describes the characteristics, distribution, and migration of human populations on Earth's surface, patterns and networks of economic interdependence on Earth's surface, process, patterns, and functions of human settlement, how forces of cooperation and conflict among people influence the division and control of Earth's surface. For element number 5, it describes how human actions modify the physical environment, how physical systems affect human systems, the change that occurs in the meaning, use, distribution, and importance of resources. And lastly, for element number 6, it describes how to apply geography to interpret the past, present, and plan for the future. These elements are used by the American Indian Geographic curriculum. But also, these elements are great to go use when curricular policies and official textbooks have failed. It is also important to note that traditional indigenous communities do not separate geography from everyday life. Everything is one. We are all equal. To finish, I leave you all with this quote from the text. Virtues such as courage, patience, generosity, and honesty originate among the creatures in this relationship. It is fundamental to all others. Thus, why it is important that when we are teaching geography, we form a connection with everything around us. Personally, when I have my classroom where I would be teaching world languages, I can implement geography by reviewing the 6 elements first, and then moving on to include language, vocabulary, cultures, customs, class discussions, group discussions, and forming a connection for my students with everything that we're learning. So depending on what part of the world we're studying or learning about. And also to mention that geography is everything, such as nature, wildlife, people, and places. That's, all included when learning about geography, and also about learning about 6 different elements. But yeah, that's how I would use this book to help me form a curriculum to teach world languages.
That concludes our overview of Teaching Truly, a book we believe to be an invaluable resource for teachers seeking to indigenize mainstream education. Thanks for watching.